I'm going to tell you about a Southern Baptist church that did something very disturbing. It's called Immanuel Baptist Church. It is in Little Rock, Arkansas. I will show you their website here because it's a large place. They have a lot of stuff going on there. Okay, a lot of activity, a lot of people. So that's Immanuel Baptist Church, but they have been having a lot of problems over the past several years. Okay, lots of problems. And here is some of those problems. Okay, first of all, it turns out they hired a guy, the assistant director of children's ministry from 2014 to 2016. His name was Patrick Miller. And he has been accused of sexual abuse by three separate women. And this is a very disturbing sentence, but bear with me. Apparently, one of them said he apparently, quote, fondled and sexually abused multiple elementary age girls after grooming them through games of hide and seek where they would be locked in darkened rooms at the church. That's the thing that happened. So, three women have accused this guy of sexual abuse. And in 2019, he was charged with second-degree sexual assault by one of them. He later pleaded guilty to misdemeanor harassment. So, he was accused. He pled guilty to a lesser charge. That was one woman. This past June, in a second case, he said he was not guilty of sexual assault and kidnapping, and that is still ongoing in the courts. And then last month, the third victim came forward with her allegations, but no formal charges have been filed yet. But obviously, one of those charges did go through, and he has already pleaded guilty to that. So this guy was employed at this church from 2014 to 2016. Disturbing. Then you have another church volunteer. Her name is Reagan Gray, and she was accused of sexually assaulting a high school boy. And she has pleaded not guilty. But again, that's an allegation that happened. Now, think about what you would do if you were the leader of this church at this time. Okay. There kind of is at this point a standard playbook for how you deal with allegations of this nature. You publicly apologize. You explain how you're going to maybe do better with background checks. Or you say, you know what? We did our background checks with these people and everything was fine. We didn't realize any of this was happening. They might say that. But then you tell your church members, we're going to give you a safe way to come forward with any other stories you might have about the accused staffers or anybody else on our staff for that matter. And you know what? You don't tell us about it. We have hired an independent investigator. We want you to take your stories to that person. They're going to investigate and report back to us later because we clearly cannot be trusted. That's what you should do at this point. There have been enough of these type of stories that good churches have responded in that way, in that responsible sort of way, to say, look, we hired them. It happens, but we didn't know it was happening. Wish we could have done more, but here's what we're going to do moving forward. That is not what this church did. Okay. At Immanuel, the pastor, Stephen Smith, first, he didn't even tell his congregation about any of the allegations against Miller, the first guy, until last December. And that was long after those allegations were made, years after the church knew those allegations had been made. Why did the pastor wait until December to tell the congregation? Well, it's because the local newspaper had just reported that day that Miller was trying to have his criminal records sealed. And they were writing an article about this guy doesn't want anyone to know what happened to him and why he was sent to court or anything like that. And that was going to go public. And the pastor's like, oh shit, the whole church is going to know that this dude's in trouble. I should probably tell them something. And by waiting as long as he did, it means there are people in the church that may have been exposed to this guy who didn't know he was a threat because the pastor just held it in. And how many people may have left the church not having reported anything and they weren't around to hear that this guy is a bad dude? Okay. And then the pastor, Stephen Smith, he did tell the congregation about Reagan Gray, that woman who was accused of stuff, but he insisted those allegations were non-criminal in nature, which is not true based on the allegations I read about. But then it gets worse. it turns out the pastor, told the leadership team that we will handle any future abuse reports with the help of an outside party. However, that outside party is going to have to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that that person cannot report back to any of the deacons who lead this church. Like, why are you not trying to be as transparent as possible? That's weird. Oh, and then he said, oh, and that third party that I'm hiring, it's not actually independent. It's just going to be a lawyer who works for our church's insurance provider who totally doesn't have a conflict of interest here. So, like, the pastor handled all this in the worst possible way. And all of that infuriated some of those deacons, some of those church leaders enough that there was actually a mini revolt. Okay. This is an article from Julie Roys, who is a Christian who writes about the church. Look at this headline that happened. This is back in February of this year. 8 deacons resign from embattled SBC megachurch after leaders require loyalty pledge. And just right here, 8 deacons of a prominent Southern Baptist megachurch in Arkansas have resigned, refusing to sign a recommitment form viewed by some as a loyalty pledge to the church's senior pastor. And basically, what happened is after those deacons, what they wanted to do is they wanted to hold a vote and cast a vote of no confidence against their pastor after he mishandled all this abuse stuff. And that vote never happened. And instead, other leadership said, hey, all of you in leadership, we're going to make you sign some new paperwork that pledges loyalty to our church no matter what. And these deacons, 8 of them, were like, I am not signing a pledge to the church and to the pastor when these are the same people who are trying to cover up abuse. So they all resigned in protest. And good for them. That's the least they could do. And the amazing thing is, after that happened, those 8 deacons, or some of them, they spoke to local reporters about all this. They spoke about how they felt, how frustrated they were, how they thought the church should have been handling these issues. And it turns out that was the last straw for Pastor Stephen Smith. He was so mad that his own former leadership team was smack talking him and his church, and they were getting a bad reputation, that he apparently told the deacons, and I am quoting here, I can't have trust restored if people inside the church are talking to the newspaper. As if the deacons speaking to reporters were the real problem and not the abuse and not the way Stephen Smith was handling the allegations of abuse. Okay, so a month later, the situation got even worse because after those deacons resign, everyone starts to find out why they left because they were talking about all the church mishaps. And then a lot of members of the church start to leave. And at this point, a month after those 8 deacons left, Stephen Smith says, all right, I'm going to resign. But by the time he finally left, hundreds of members had already walked out the door. So huge mess. And it was all due to this pastor's shitty leadership. But it could also be blamed partly on the fact that they were trying to make all this up as they went along. They didn't have a playbook in place for how to handle allegations of abuse. What happens if someone comes forward? What should we do? There were no policies in place for how to handle any of it. And that's why this month, for the first time in this megachurch's 132-year history, the current deacons leading the church have said, hey, church, we have written a set of bylaws, the playbook, the rule book for our church, and everyone will have to follow these rules. And just to give you one example, if there's any suspected child abuse, everyone, staffers, members, everybody, they have to report it to the Arkansas Child Abuse Hotline, which is run by the state. And I think that's good. That's very important. Do not tell the church leadership about it. Don't tell some independent lawyer who totally works for the church about it. Go to the state officials, tell local law enforcement. That's how we handle it now. I think that's commendable. That's very good. But I want to show you the part of the bylaws that is getting all the attention. And it's section 11.4, called Biblical Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution. All right. And I'm going to skip ahead to 11.4.2. 11.4.2. Look at this. I'm scrolling in a bit. Church members are expected to avoid making statements to the general public, media, or via the internet with intent to breach church business confidentialities, injure the reputation of the church, or disregard Jesus' imperative to love one another as he loves us, so that others will know we are his disciples. Something, something Bible verse. What the hell is that? That is basically a rule that everyone has to follow that says you are not allowed to talk shit about us in public. No talking to reporters. No writing snarky Facebook posts because the pastor said something disturbing during a sermon. None of that. If you do it, it hurts our reputation and we will kick you out of here. And I would argue that if someone says my pastor said something horrible or our church mishandled allegations of sexual abuse, I would say saying that publicly because you want the church to do better is actually an act of love, which is kind of what they want, but that's clearly not what they think. I also want to point this out. Look at the section right above that, 11.4.1. It's some of the same thing. Church members are expected to prayerfully attempt to resolve disputes among themselves or alongside staff pastors or ministers. So if we have any problem, we're going to deal with it internally. And then they quote 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Well, guess what that chapter and verse says? Here, let me show you, because this is what they think about outside people. If any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? So if you have a conflict and you go to like the cops to talk about it, or you go to a mediator, or you air your dirty laundry in public, you're letting the ungodly see it. And how dare you do that? We handle all our shit inside, which is what cults do. Like, honestly, the only reason those two church members and the allegations against them, the only reason anything ever happened with that is because secular authorities stepped in when church leaders would not. All right. And consider this. Let's say these bylaws go into effect. What would happen if church members posted something on Facebook about what their church did? Or if they spoke to their neighbors about it? Or they spoke to a reporter about it? They could be excommunicated. And honestly, there's actually nothing about how excommunication would work in the bylaws other than to say it will meet biblical requirements and principles, which is very vague and doesn't tell you what they're going to do. But as we've talked about on this show, and I've written about this many times, if you are excommunicated, if you are, what's the word I'm looking for with the Jehovah's Witnesses? Something. But if you're kicked out of your church, disfellowshipped, it has a very traumatic effect on the people who are victims of that, because you're basically cutting them off from their friends, their families, their social safety nets. It could be very, very bad. And the fact that this church doesn't go into detail about that is very concerning. What if a church member wanted to go public about the abuse they suffered at the hands of a church employee? I mean, given this church's history, I don't trust them to handle it internally. I only trust that something will happen if they go public with it. And then back to the bylaws for a second, where they said you can't breach church business confidentialities. Like, what does that even entail? What, are you telling people how much was donated via tithes? Is that somehow secret information? It shouldn't be. And this thing about we don't want you to injure the reputation. Oh, I'm sorry. What if you have the intent to breach confidentiality or injure the reputation of the church? What does intent mean? Because if I wanted to say this church is doing something wrong, I would say it's because I want the church to do better, not because I want to destroy them. So whose intent counts? Does my intent to make the church a better place count for something? I don't know. I don't know. And why is maintaining the church's reputation, no matter what, a requirement for membership or employment. Whistleblowing should not be punished, especially if the goal is improving the church. I mean, sometimes it takes airing out the dirty laundry for organizations to fix themselves. That is often the case with abuse allegations. So here's the thing, it's not like this sort of rule in the bylaws. It's not like other churches have this in their rules. And in fact, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, they spoke to the former Southern Baptist Convention president, Bart Barber, because he would know. And they asked him, like, hey, is this something a lot of your churches do? And he said, and I quote, "That's the first I have ever seen of a mention of the media in governing documents." And Bart Barber is horrible enough that he thinks, 11-year-old rape victims should be forced to have their rapist babies. That guy's like, wow, this church is going a little too far. So here's the thing. For now, these bylaws have not been adopted. Church members have to vote on whether they want to adopt these rules in mid-November. And about 10 days before that, an updated version of these bylaws will go up, like the final version before everyone votes on it. And that means church members have another 2 weeks to weigh in with their thoughts on what's right, what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. The thing is, I don't know if this don't talk to people outside the church, if you're going to trash us, I don't know if that rule is anything anyone else cares about. So either they go all in on silencing critics within the church and go down the cult pathway, or they admit that maybe public scrutiny is warranted, even if it's unpleasant. And it should not be a difficult choice. But this is a conservative Baptist church, so I honestly do not know which option they're going to go with. We'll find out soon. Okay, I think I am done. What other questions and thoughts do we have here? Church leaders should be mandatory reporters. Yes, totally agree. I work at a public school. I have long worked at a public school. When I was a teacher, I was obviously a mandatory reporter. If a kid came to me in confidence and said, my parents are abusing me, I would legally be required to tell the counselor, who would be required to tell local law enforcement, or whatever the chain of command was there. But church leaders and the Catholic Church has opposed this at every turn. When laws try to make church leaders mandatory reporters, they want to be exempt from it. They don't think they should have to tell anybody what is happening, even if it might save a kid's life or protect them. It's disturbing. And you have to wonder, anytime a church says we don't want to be mandatory reporters, why not? What do you think is going to happen if we make you one? And the Catholic Church's argument, by the way, is if someone tells us during confession that they have been abused or they are abusing someone else, you want the priest to tell the police that, but they're like, well, that would be breaking the rules of confession, as if the rules of confession are more important than protecting the kids who may be vulnerable. That's what their priorities are. Straight up, an NDA in their bylaws. I know. Like I said, it's very cultish. And the people at this church should be genuinely freaked out about this, because they're literally signing their life over to this church, and it's not going to end well. Can you see a future where churches can't get insurance because too many sexual abuse lawsuits? Yes. I think I talked about this in a video. I can't remember when I did it, but the Catholic Church actually, individual parishes and stuff, they can get insurance for sexual abuse. And some insurance providers are like, oh man, we're going to have to jack up the prices this month. Seriously, do a Google search right now for Catholic insurance sexual abuse. You will find companies that offer churches sexual abuse insurance. And a lot of them have it, not just Catholic ones. A lot of them have it. And you have to imagine they're going to get priced out of it in some cases. Oh, this Atheist News Roundup is the best. Thank you so much, Sean. I appreciate that. Thank you for that donation, poor Claire. Well, if you're poor, I really appreciate it. Just started watching your channel, and I love it. I wish everyone would watch it. Me too. Get me to 1 million subscribers, everybody. Or whatever I'm at. I don't count. Thank you for what you and Den do in helping to give greater exposure to what really goes on inside religious institutions. Everyone gets a hug. Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. And thank you, Den. I fully agree. Cannot do this without Den.